Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm Keith Down, your host, and today we welcome back a friend of Morning Joy, Jacob Stein, Catholic theologian, and he also runs Crux Stationalis, an apostolate where he explores the Catholic faith through the eyes of Rome and the Roman Station Church. How did I do there, Jacob?
You are getting better each time, and I think it's because I was only on maybe a while back, a couple weeks ago, so I think I need to come on more often, and that way you have the practice.
Probably, yes. We really appreciate you joining us. Now, Pope Francis has released his fourth encyclical, Delixit Nos, I believe is English. In English, it's He Loved Us, right before the weekend. I guess before we jump into it, for those that might not be familiar with what are encyclicals, could you maybe tell us a little about, what is an encyclical exactly?
It's a document which really enters into the magisterium of the church. So it's not just a letter, it's not just a disciplinary thing, it's highlighting magisterial teaching, becoming part of it. And this one's very interesting because it comes right at the end of this synodal process that has been going on, which all these, EWTN has been reporting on. I'm sure you've been speaking about it on the radio quite regularly, as I just heard in the announcements a bit ago. And so it's this authoritative text, and we draw teaching from it. And obviously, we know Revelation is closed. There is no new revelations that can come in the church, but these texts are this highest form of teaching, which unfolds the treasures. And especially when we're talking about the Sacred Heart, the Pope has gone and he's listed the saints. He's talked about the history of really that the heart of Christ is the treasure of all teaching, of all our faith and belief. And so it's a really intriguing document.
So is this encyclical? Encyclicals are meant for everybody to read, right? It's not just meant for the priests and the clergy, right? This is for everybody.
Correct. Usually you have at the beginning of an encyclical sort of to the bishops, to everyone, to this whole long list of people, and the faithful are included. In this one, he doesn't have that at the beginning words, but yes, an encyclical is for the whole church.
Interesting. Well, one thing that I find really fascinating is that I haven't heard much of a peep on social media about this. So from what it sounds like, it's not controversy in that matter. But what's been your impression on the document itself?
Interestingly, I think maybe, you're not getting controversial tweets and things like that. Mm-hmm. But there was a great report on the day that it came out. And I think there's so much going on in the life of the church right now that it's hard to digest this encyclical so quickly, especially we just had the end of the synod. We had the final document of the synod. The Pope approved that document as also not on the same level as an encyclical, but it also enters into magisterium as well. And so sometimes, because I work in this journalistic world, not as a journalist, but as a theologian, as a social media content creator. And these months have been so busy with the Pope being in Asia, in Belgium, Luxembourg, the Synod, and now this encyclical. I think it's really important that we stop and reflect, read this document, take some days, some weeks, add it to your daily reading. Even if you can't get through all of it, if you can go, you can skim, you can see what sticks out with you, and then jump into that section. Sometimes the history might not be so important, but he speaks about St. Therese, he speaks about St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, he speaks about the Jesuit priests who were so instrumental. And we see that with this document, the sort of apex of Pope Francis's persona, his papacy, and you see that he's a Jesuit. If people are following me on Crux Stationalis, you often see that I'm going to this chapel where this image of the Sacred Heart is in Rome, which is at the Jesuit headquarters, not headquarters, their principal church. And It's at the Church of of Jesus. um, and you see the charism of the Jesuits and how that's informed the Pope. Obviously, he's been formed for years in the Jesuits. He's lived that life. He speaks about St. Ignatius every so often. You can see in the way he preaches that he has the same pedagogy. And so you also can see that it's important, that it's not insignificant that this image of the Sacred Heart sits in the principal church of the Jesuits in the world, in Rome. And it's a bit cliche as you start reading the encyclical, because he's saying, we have to get back to the heart. You have to get back to the heart. And I was reading it and you kind of chuckle to yourself like, oh, okay, you have to get beyond. And I think he does this. You have to get beyond the cheesiness, just the fact that it's popular piety. And you have to realize that it is meant to inform everything we do. And it puts everything else in context.
Right. And I really found, if there's, I think, an EWTN article, we might link it in the show notes, where it kind of shows some of the top quotes or quotable things that were in this encyclical. And one that I always gravitate towards too, just because we're so surrounded by it now. It's in this age of artificial intelligence, we cannot forget that poetry and love are necessary to save our humanity. So basically saying we shouldn't put too much emphasis or crutch on artificial intelligence, from what I gathered.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, you hear all the fear mongering around the use of AI, the use of these technological advances. And I think people are going to have to go deep into these questions that are presented in the encyclical, or the Pope kind of authoritatively puts limits around these technological advances. And he, with beyond those fears, you also hear the consistent fears in the church with things like the synod, with these controversial issues. And we have a safeguard in this document. We have, in the sense that he says, we return to Christ, we return to his heart, we return to the incarnation, which through the incarnation, we've been able to become so intimately tied to God, to Christ. And all of the sort of moments of poetry that the Pope speaks about, he talks about making pastries with his grandmother when he was little, and it's like stories from an old man, and it's an interesting read, because it's different than the social encyclicals that the Pope presented with Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si. And instead, it doesn't negate these social encyclicals based on Catholic social teaching and this promotion of sort of going forth as a church. But he says we can't go forth without returning to the heart of Christ. And that should make us feel a bit more at ease, especially when sometimes, you're listening to reports, you're listening, all these podcasts and blogs and things, or even just simple news reporting, and people get afraid, they can't understand the context. And yet you have this document which tells us to return to Christ, and this teaching of the Sacred Heart, this devotion to the Sacred Heart, which the Pope describes, goes back to the scriptures, goes back to the revelation of Christ himself. So it's not some 18th century, 17th century devotion stuck in time, or something that's only in sort of modern devotions. And it's not just pietistic, but contemplating the heart of Christ is going to help us love God more, love him above all things, as well as loving our neighbor as ourselves, which is where that social aspect of the Catholic life enters in. And the Pope is trying to tell us that with all the problems going on in the world, these things shouldn't be divorced from each other. And so sometimes when we criticize this emphasis, a lot of emphasis throughout the papacy of social teaching, that maybe we just don't understand. Where is he getting this impetus? He's getting it from his devotion to the Sacred Heart. And he's telling us, don't separate him. And I think that's something that just reading through, the Pope kind of has always done this thing throughout his papacy where he kind of likes to shock us, which can come off on the personal level a bit as a challenge. And I think he really he enjoys challenging us. And it's something now that we have easy access to, quick access to. We've spoke about this before with social media. And the papacy has been a new realm because of social media. And the Pope's personality hopefully will shine through even more through this encyclical on the Sacred Heart.
Wow. One thing before we have like about 40 seconds left. I mentioned it earlier that they moved the chair of St. Peter towards the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica. What was do you know the reason behind that?
Well, they're preparing for the Jubilee. So there's been the renovation of the baldachin, which sits above the tomb of St. Peter. And they're also in that was paid for by the Knights of Columbus. In that, they're also restoring the altar of the chair, the big statue made by Bernini with the chair and the four doctors of the church. And usually the relic is inside that altar. And so in the restoration, they brought it forth for us to observe for the next 6 weeks, basically, in Rome.
Wow. So cool. Wow. Thank you, Jacob, for joining us this morning. Well, afternoon, you're in Rome. But thank you so much. We can find more about you. We'll put it in the show notes, his handle, but it's Crux Stationalis. All right, so we'll make sure to find him on social media, on Instagram, YouTube. Thanks again, Jacob, for your time.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
Absolutely, as always. And that is the end of Morning Joy, where truth matters. There's a couple ways we can go. We can listen to Mass if you're on the radio. Make sure to pray for us. We will continue to pray for your intentions, as always. Otherwise, you should join us for the After Show Clubhouse, where we get to hang out with you, debrief from the show, expand on some of these topics. They're very important, like Halloween, confession, so on and so forth. Just search Morning Joy Radio, or you can always search GRN online as they produce this wonderful show. But this is us parting ways. God bless, make it a joyful day, and we'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Central, 7 a.m. Eastern, here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.